which they could exploit and dispose of as they wished. Even during the period after the independence of the majority of the African countries, the continent has had to live with the reality of the system of neocolonialism, which perpetuated Africa's dependence. Inter alia, it was this history which made it possible for some Europeans to convince themselves that they had no need to define a strategic relationship between themselves and our continent. The end of the Cold War created the possibility for our continent finally to reclaim its right to determine its destiny and, among other things, to define its relationships with the rest of the world. NEPAD was adopted at the last assembly of the OAU, Heads of State and Government, which was held in Lusaka, Zambia in 2001. The partnerships we visualized as we worked on NEPAD were a mutually beneficial partnership among ourselves as Africans, and a mutually beneficial partnership between Africa and the rest of the world. I'm convinced that one of the greatest achievements of the African continent and its organizations, the OAU and the AU, during the first decade of the 21st century, was the acceptance of NEPAD and its partner African Peer Review Mechanism, the APRM, by the rest of the world as a defining program which should inform the relations of the continent with the rest of the international community. In this regard, in September and December 2002, speaking for the World Community of Nations, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a declaration and resolution which said, respectively, that we affirm that international support for the implementation of NEPAD is essential. We urge the international community and the United Nations system to organize support for African countries in accordance with the principles, objectives, and priorities of the new partnership in the new spirit of partnership. The declaration adopted also at the first Africa-EU summit meeting after the birth of NEPAD, held in Lisbon in 2007, said, in recognition of our ambitions and of all that we share today and have shared in the past, we are resolved to build a new EU-Africa strategic political partnership for the future, overcoming the traditional donor-recipient relationship and building on common values and goals in our pursuit of peace and stability, democracy and rule of law, progress and development. We will develop this partnership of equals based on the effective engagement of our societies. Earlier in 2002, in their Africa Action Plan, the G8 had said, we, the heads of state and government of 8 major industrialized democracies and the representatives of the European Union, welcome the initiative taken by the African states in adopting the new Partnership for Africa's Development. We accept the invitation from African leaders extended first at Genoa and so on, to build a new partnership between the countries of Africa and our own, based on mutual responsibility and respect. The same theme was taken up by the president of China, President Hu Jintao, in 2006, as it was by Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori of Japan when he visited us here in 2001. And Yoshiro Mori said, in this age of globalization, as the world becomes increasingly unified, it would be unthinkable to talk about the world of tomorrow without considering sub-Saharan Africa. If it can overcome the difficulties it faces and open the way towards a bright future, Africa will probably become the driving force behind the vibrant development of human society in the 21st century. On the other hand, if the problems of Africa are neglected and 1/4 of the world's nations remain alienated, there is no reason that the world community should be able to prosper and to maintain stability. Indeed, there will be no stability and prosperity in the world in the 21st century unless the problems of Africa are resolved. I believe that we should agree with Yoshiro Mori that there will indeed be no stability and prosperity in the world in the 21st century unless the problems of Africa are resolved. The current global economic and financial crisis has thrown into very sharp relief the important question: how should the international community act to respond to the challenge posed by Yoshiro Mori? In this context, it had seemed to be self-evident that because they are poor, Africans would be among those who would suffer most from the effects of this crisis, and therefore that any meaningful response to the crisis would pay particular attention to Africa. Our hopes were raised indeed when on April 2nd, 2009, the London G20 summit meeting said that we recognize that the current crisis has a disproportionate impact on the vulnerable and poorest countries, and recognize our collective responsibility to mitigate the social impact of the crisis, to minimize long-lasting damage to global potential. Earlier, we spoke about the adoption by the G8 of the Africa Action Plan in 2002, which constituted a detailed response to support the objectives contained in the NEPAD program. The reality is that the G8 Africa Action Plan constitutes the only extant and comprehensive framework defining an equitable partnership between Africa and the developed world. The tragedy is that in practical terms, this action plan has fallen by the wayside. The G20 has now replaced the G8, which, despite its obvious limitations, signifies an important step forward towards the democratization of the system of global economic governance. Despite taking some welcome measures to assist Africa and the developing world to mitigate the effects of the global economic crisis, the G20 has not adopted the Africa Action Plan. It therefore does not have an integrated program to respond to Africa's development challenges. As recently as last month, on April the 23rd, in their communique issued after their meeting in Washington, D.C., the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors said, "We will ask the World Bank to advise us on progress in promoting development and poverty reduction as part of rebalancing of global growth." What all this means is that in its programs relating to the global economic crisis, the developed world has not treated the response to the challenges of Africa's development as one of its strategic tasks. In a March 2009 paper on Africa and the global financial crisis, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa discussed the importance of the stimulus packages put in place by the developed countries to mediate the impact of the crisis by increasing aggregate demand. In this regard, it said, how does Africa feature in the discussions on the global increase in aggregate demand? The answer is that Africa has not featured in this discussion, except in asides that refer to the limited ability of emerging and developing countries to undertake fiscal stimulus programs. The reality is that once more, Africa has drifted to the periphery, contrary to what we sought to achieve, that is, to place the challenge of Africa's development at the center of the global agenda, arguing, as Yoshiro Mori did, that there will be no stability and prosperity in the world in the 21st century unless the problems of Africa are resolved. This situation emphasizes the vitally important imperative that, among other things, we must re-energize our programs focused on relying on our resources to achieve Africa's development, inspired by the objective to encourage self-reliance. That we must promote our regional and continental integration, including by building transboundary infrastructure, and that we should build the international solidarity movement to help ensure the necessary resource transfers and access to markets which Africa needs to achieve her development. In this context, the question that remains to be answered is, what is to be done? In this regard, I'd like to propose 6 steps forward. First of all, we should recall what Haile Selassie said. 47 years ago that the task on which we have embarked, the making of Africa, will not wait. We must act to shape and mold the future and leave our imprint on events as they pass into history. We seek to determine whether we are going and to chart the course of our destiny. During the 47 years since the founding of the OAU, our continent has taken many collective decisions which answer the question, whither are we going, and therefore chart the course of our destiny. Accordingly, and fortunately, we are not faced with the task to elaborate the fundamental policies that will result in the renaissance of Africa. This work has been done. The work that has been done has taken into account our many painful experiences since we freed ourselves from the shackles of imperialism, of colonialism, and apartheid. This includes the lessons from our journey to achieve Africa's rebirth in a situation in which we are constrained by global political geometry defined by the Cold War and institutions dominated by Africa's erstwhile colonial masters, by violent conflicts among ourselves, including the horrendous genocide in Rwanda, constrained by domination by leaders who were nothing less than rapacious monsters, by failures to implement such far-sighted programs as the Lagos Plan of Action for the socio-economic transformation of Africa, by the prevalence among our ruling elites of a culture of self-enrichment through theft and corruption, and by the demobilization of the masses of our people, turning them away from the task to engage in continuing struggle as their own liberators. The challenge we confront is to answer the question practically: what shall we do to translate the policies and programs our continent has adopted to achieve Africa's renewal, to transform those into reality? As we celebrate Africa Day, we must therefore identify the practical steps we must take in this regard. One of these is to build and nurture the native intellectual cadre committed to the transformation of Africa as visualized by leading African patriots and thinkers for 150 years, from Tio Soga to Uadi Waseluhlangeni and Haile Selassie, and onwards to Sheikh Anta Diop, Aikwe Arma, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, among others. An urgent task in this regard is to rebuild and sustain our universities and other centers of learning, attract back to Africa the intelligentsia that has migrated to the developed North, build strong links with intelligentsia in the African diaspora, and give the space to these, the time and space they need to help determine the future of the Africans. Another is to develop the capacity of our state, our government, our business, and civil society institutions to implement the already agreed continental programs, which visualize a renewed Africa of peace, of democracy, of development, of unity and pride in its place as a driving force behind vibrant development of human society in the 21st century, of which the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori spoke. What this surely means, among other things, is that we should resurrect the African Renaissance movement, which many African patriots in many African countries launched at the beginning of the 21st century, which sought to mobilize and unite the African masses so that once more, as we did in the struggle against colonialism and apartheid, we act as our own liberators. When I spoke at an occasion in August 1998 to launch this movement here in our country, I said that to be a true African is to be a rebel in the cause of the African Renaissance, whose success in the new century and millennium is one of the great historic challenges of our time. And further, we quoted the Senegalese, Sheikh Anta Diop, when he said, "The African who has understood us is one who, after reading our works, would have felt a birth in himself of another person, impelled by an historical conscience, a true creator, a Promethean carrier of a new civilization, and perfectly aware of what the whole earth owes to his ancestral genius in all the domains of science, of culture, and of religion. The African Renaissance movement of which I speak should indeed seek to inspire the millions of African masses to feel a birth in themselves of another person, a true creator, a Promethean carrier of a new civilization. And together we must be the organizers of this movement. Yet another practical step we must take is to increase the momentum in terms of which the development and the transformation of Africa came to take its rightful and prominent place in the global agenda, binding the rest of the world to interact with our continent according to principles, objectives, and programs Africa itself had set, which include the critically important objective of the eradication of poverty and underdevelopment. In this context, our international partners agreed to join us in creating the necessary institutional mechanisms to give practical effect to the kind of partnership spelled out in NEPAD and effectively address the challenge of mutual accountability. In this regard, we must engage in struggle to ensure that the global agenda addresses such imperatives as capital and other resource transfers to Africa, the conclusion of the Doha Development Round as a development round, and the democratization of the international system of governance, which must not be delayed any further. Another matter on which we must act is to achieve African cohesion in terms both of what the continent says to itself and what it says to the rest of the world. The objective to achieve the unity of our continent, perhaps as a federation or confederation of states, will take time to achieve. However, this does not mean that Africa cannot speak with one voice on matters of common interest. Of critical importance in this regard is that we should do everything possible to strengthen both the regional organizations, that's the regional economic communities such as ECOWAS and SADC, and the African Union and its institutions, including the Pan-African Parliament and others. There's no gainsaying the fact that all these institutions are relatively weak, which militates against the capacity of our